The next part of our morning is I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Jetha. Michelle is a research associate for the Center of Lifespan Development and Research. She's a member of the Cognitive Affective Neuroscience Lab at Brock University, a member of the Society for Psychophysiological Research, instructor for McMaster and Brock Universities, and works as a research consultant with a focus on translational neuroscience involving developmental psychopathology. Now, last night, when I was telling her that I was going to be introducing her, she told me that her bio has now changed. So I thought, oh my gosh. And what it is that Michelle is just taken a new position, although she's going to continue her relationship with McMaster and Brock, has taken a new position with the New Brunswick University, NBU.
No, CBU.
I'm sorry.
Cape Breton University.
Sorry. I think New Brunswick University is jealous. And that's going to be starting in August. She's published extensively on the influence of personality on social and emotional processing in healthy and clinical populations, including schizophrenia, autism, disruptive behavioral disorders, a major review of adolescent EEG and ERP development, and has recently co-authored Adolescent Brain Development, Implications for Behavior. So welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you very much. Glad to be back here. I was here a few weeks ago and enjoyed some staff. We did some staff training, so I gave this same talk to the staff members, and it was very well received. So I'm hoping that we'll have the same amount of fun today as we did over that day. Okay, so I am going to be talking today about adolescent brain development implications for behavior. And only as recently as the mid-1990s, it was thought that brain development was complete by about the age of 3. Let's see if this is working here. Yeah. And we now know that that's simply not the case, that the brain continues to organize, adapt, and change well into early adulthood. And as Jay Gee down at NIH puts it, even though the first 3 years are important, so are the next 16. There's still enormous dynamic activity happening in brain biology. I think that this might have been somewhat overlooked with the emphasis on the early years. So today I'll be highlighting important changes in the brain that are taking place over the adolescent period from childhood through young adulthood, and we'll discuss as well the implications of these changes. Now, as our first speaker was mentioning, there's been an explosion of research over the past few decades. And with the advent of new technology, there's been a number of studies. So if you just do enormous amount of studies, if you do a simple online search on PubMed from 2000 to 2010, putting in the words adolescence and brain development, there are over 5,000 articles, empirically reviewed articles, peer-reviewed articles. And we're going to only be talking about this. We're going to talk a summary of some of it. Obviously, we can't touch on all these findings, but we're going to talk about some of these findings. So what we know from this study, and this is a large study that was conducted down at NIH. It was large in the sense that it was over a long period of time. This study looked at 13 children for every 2 years. They scanned their brains every 2 years. And what we know from this study, from the ages of 5 to age of 20, and what we know from this study and others like it is that the cortex, the area of the brain that is responsible for the processing, follows an inverted shape U developmental trajectory. It first begins to thicken, and then it begins to thin. And we know that also that this thickening and thinning is region-specific, that it is occurring first in regions of the brain that are responsible for the most basic functions, such as sensory and motor processing, and then it goes on to regions such as those responsible for spatial orientation and language. And lastly, into those areas that are responsible for executive functioning. So those areas responsible for higher order thinking, planning, strategizing, and organizing. Some of the last regions to mature are those involved in integrating information, and we call these regions association areas. In adolescence, one of the last regions to mature is the dorsolateral prefrontal area. So these association regions are the regions that integrate information from multiple brain regions. In this slide, we're going to be zooming in on the gray matter. So the gray matter that we were just looking at, so the higher, the cortical regions, the gray matter is composed of the cell bodies and the dendrites. And these dendrites are what form the connections between neurons. And they form the connections in junctions called synapses. So the synapses would be, for instance, here and here. So when the thinning is taking place, when the thickening is taking place that we talked about in the previous slide, these synapses are building up. They're multiplying, synaptogenesis. When they are thinning, these synapses in the brain are being lost. And they follow a use it or lose it policy. So those synapses that are not used are lost, and those synapses are not frequently used are lost, and those that are frequently used are maintained. The brain is a very inexpensive organ to use in terms of energy expenditure. So we don't want the brain to expend energy, the brain doesn't want to expend energy in terms of maintaining synapses that are not going to be used. So this follows a use it or lose it policy, and it's according to experience. So the brain wires according to experience. Now also in this slide of note is the axon on the neuron. So the axon is part of the neuron. The axon is what white matter is composed of. White matter is the part of the brain we'll be discussing in the next slide as well that is responsible for connectivity between regions. And in addition to just pointing out the axon, I want to point out the myelin sheath. So this sheath that covers the axon is called myelin, and we're going to talk a little bit about myelin development as well. As myelin develops, the speed of the neuron increases, the processing speed increases, so neurons are able to more effectively communicate. So the speed of neuronal transmission increases as a result of what's called myelination, the laying down of this sheath on the axons. In this slide, we are looking at white matter development. We're going to be looking at white matter development here. Across the adolescent period, we see here that white matter development is linear. Up in the top left, we see an image of the brain, and we can see the white matter underneath the cortex, and it's responsible for connectivity between brain regions. What we know in terms of adolescence is that the white matter, there are a number of white matter tracts that are still developing over the adolescent period. The tracts that are developing over the adolescent period include those that are responsible for top-down regulation of limbic regions, of emotional regions of the brain, those that are responsible or involved in emotion reactivity, as well as those that are responsible for interhemispheric activity, so crosstalk between the hemispheres. As well, myelin is also developing over the adolescent period, particularly in those tracts as well, in the tracts that I just mentioned. White matter also follows a region-specific type of development. So it is first occurring in the areas involved in sensory motor regions, then in spatial orientation and language areas, and later in the higher order cortical regions, the higher order regions responsible for planning, strategizing, goal setting, problem solving, etc. So during the adolescent period, the tracts that are developing, the tracts that are myelinating, are those involved primarily in self-regulation. And what's important about myelination is that as it develops, as it matures, it limits plasticity in those regions. Okay, so as the myelin develops, there's a window of time as the myelin's developing, and as the myelination is complete, then the brain plasticity in that area is limited. So during this time, all of the white matter tracks that we've been discussing during adolescence up until young adulthood, the brain is wiring according to experience. We know that a lot of this, what's going on in terms of the wiring, is experience dependent. So when we think about the windows of time, we can think about language development. Up until a certain point, around age 13, it's easy to learn a second language, but after 13, it's not so easy to learn a second language. Okay. So why is this important? We've talked, up until now, we've talked about gray matter development. We've talked about gray matter maturation. We've talked about white matter maturation. And we've talked about the fact that it's experience dependent, and that in some respects there are windows of time when experience can affect change. This is a period, this period of adolescence is a period of vulnerability and opportunity. Vulnerability to adverse experiences and opportunity for positive brain growth. So prevention and intervention can enhance positive brain growth and development. Experience matters. What an adolescent engages in, what type of behavior, what type of learning, whether they're out doing sports or they're inside playing video games on the couch, matters in terms of brain development. And I'm sure many of you have seen some of the studies that have looked at the new digital world and how that might be affecting brain development, although we won't be touching on that topic today. Another thing that we've learned from advanced technology is something about brain networks. We learned that, first of all, that brain development, it doesn't occur in a linear fashion, doesn't occur overall. Everything's not happening at the same time, that the brain is not maturing overall in a linear fashion, that it's region specific. We also know that the maturation is reflected in the emergence of networks. So we can look at the maturation of connectivity. And there are 2 points that I want to make with respect to what we've learned in terms of the maturation of connectivity. The first point is that, and if we're looking at this graph here, what we're seeing here is a group of children, adolescents, and adults engaged in a conflict. We're seeing results from the brain scan of children, adolescents, and adults engaged in a conflict monitoring task that would have been age appropriate, so it's adjusted for complexity across the age groups, just in terms of complexity across the age groups. And we see here that there's activation in the frontal regions while the children, adolescents, and adults are engaging in this task. What you note here is that the activity in the frontal regions for children is more diffuse than for adolescents and adults. So as the child matures, as adolescents go from adolescence to adulthood, this activation in terms of the challenge of a cognitive task that would engage prefrontal areas changes from being more spread out, widely distributed, to being more focused and specialized. So that's the first point. The second point, and the second thing that we were learning, the second very important point that we're learning from all of these studies on connectivity, is that the amount of connections are increasing dramatically. The amount of long-range connections spanning multiple regions of the brain, are increasing dramatically. So we see here an example of the amount of connections that would be for children, a group of children, and I've seen a graph. I didn't put it because I couldn't fit them all on the same slide, but there is you can have to trust me with this. There's an intermediate stage for adolescents. They don't go, you don't jump right to the adulthood. So there's a nice intermediate stage where there are a fewer number of connections, and then there's the largest number of connections for adulthood. So with the increase of these connections, and the brain is able to more flexibly solve problems because the brain is drawing on multiple regions in terms of processing. So processing becomes more integrative, and it spans multiple regions as the child matures. And with this, the brain is becoming more efficient. It's becoming a more efficient problem solver. Okay, so we know circuits are becoming more specialized as the child matures into adolescence and adulthood. And I just mentioned, as long-range connections increase, the workload becomes more widely distributed. So I'd like to use the example here of putting on a symposium. If only 2 people were responsible for putting on this symposium, then each of those individuals would be very taxed, right, in terms of workload. But if we had 10 people putting on the symposium, then each individual wouldn't be as taxed in terms of workload, and we'd have more solutions in terms of problems. We would have more resources to draw upon. So we can think of the brain in terms of that. With these long-range connections, the brain has more resources to draw upon, and we can become more effective problem solvers. So processing becomes more efficient. And changes during the adolescent period are most dramatic for those between the prefrontal connections and top-down regulation of limbic regions. Now, right here, I just want to give a nice little example or a nice little metaphor for understanding better the prefrontal regions and the limbic regions. So this comes from the BrainWise curriculum. I'm borrowing it. Essentially, we can look at this, we can talk about this in terms of the wizard brain and the lizard brain. The limbic regions are, I like to refer to them for explanatory purposes as the lizard brain. It's the part of the brain, the subcortical regions of the brain are the parts of the brain that we share with all other mammals, and we share them with lizards as well, okay? So this is the part of the brain that's more automatic in terms of processing, automatic urges for withdrawing from aversive stimuli and going towards stimuli that are pleasurable. So we approach rewarding things in the environment, and we withdraw from, at the most basic level, we withdraw from environmental stimuli that are aversive. And we can think of that as in terms of the limbic regions in terms of the lizard brain. Our prefrontal areas are the ones that mediate executive functions and planning and strategizing. We can think of that as the wizard brain. That's the part of the brain that is exerting top-down control on the lizard brain. So we have the wizard brain and the lizard brain. A lot of times, the lizard brain is doing most of the thinking, and we have to remind ourselves, remind children to use the wizard brain. Right? And what's still developing during the adolescent period are the connections, importantly for us, are the connections involved between the wizard brain and the lizard brain, those involved in self-regulation. Okay, so we know that voluntary behavior engages prefrontal cortex and prefrontal areas, the wizard brain, as we just mentioned. And we also know that from the slide on connectivity, that adolescents show a greater activity in these regions during challenges. We also know that adults distribute the workload more effectively. Adolescents are often working at maximum capacity with respect to these prefrontal regions. So the adolescent starts their day, and around the time of puberty, there's a change in circadian rhythms and sleep cycles, so they need more sleep, so they often start their day sleep deprived. If you add that to that, psychosocial stress at home with family problems and stress at home, then they get to school, there are additional problems in terms of peer relations. They're often working in terms of system overload. And if this system that we're talking about, this frontal system, is responsible for planning, judging, evaluating, organizing, goal setting, then if they're experiencing system overload, they will show impaired judgment. They will show impulsivity. And as we'll talk about later in the talk, this also has effect on their susceptibility or their vulnerability to peer influences. So I also want to mention here the idea of hot and cold cognition. Oftentimes, we'll see a child, we'll talk to them, and if we were discussing the types of decisions they would make in a particular situation, they appear very adult-like. They make very rational decisions, and it appears that they are very cognizant and aware of the correct decisions to make. Put them in an emotional context, especially in one that overloads their system, they're not going to show such judgment. That's called hot cognition. We refer to that as hot cognition in the emotional context. And from this understanding, from this brain perspective, what's going on, we can understand better how the system becomes overloaded and how they may not make such great decisions in those cases. So understanding what we know in terms of brain development in these areas and what might go on in terms of system overload, we know that the outcome, what's going on with the adolescent, is going to be heavily dependent in terms of the guidance that they receive from parents and caregivers and community workers. So it's important to understand this level of analysis, to understand what's going on for that time, particularly around the time of puberty, as we'll see. Now, I mentioned that there's opportunities for positive brain growth, and it's also a vulnerable time for negative influences. Around the time of puberty, there's also an increase in reward sensitivity. We'll be talking about that throughout the talk today. And what we see is an increased use of substances. There's an increase in substance abuse around the time of adolescence, the onset of adolescence. This study is an interesting study because it's not focused on alcohol use disorder. It's taken from a larger study by Tapper, and it was looking particularly at binge drinking, somewhat normal levels of binge drinking, and as defined, 4 to 5 alcoholic beverages in one sitting during 3 months prior to imaging. 4 to 5 beverages in one sitting in the 3-month period prior to imaging. 4 for girls, 5 for boys. Okay. Is this everyone? Okay. Right. So what we see here is that, and they also took measures of hangover effects and lifetime, amount of lifetime drinking, amount of alcohol assessed over the lifetime, as well as they estimated blood alcohol concentration levels over the past 3 months. Just between the groups, and there were adolescents who didn't fall into this binge drinking category, actually. That's amazing, right? So they have 2 groups, binge drinking group, a binge drinking group and a non-binge drinking group. And in the binge drinking group, for these 14, there was 14 and 14, the binge drinking group showed 18 areas of white matter, loss of white matter integrity. So 18 areas, some replicating results previously seen in the corpus callosum area, and other areas, 15 other areas. So loss of white matter integrity as a result of heavy bouts of alcohol use, or not so heavy, depending how we think of it. And the intensity, or the degree of this loss, was related to hangover effects that they measured, as well as blood alcohol concentration levels over the past 3 months. So these children did not meet the criteria for dependence. This is just normal, typical alcohol use. And they do have this group had a larger history in terms of amount, in terms of drinks that they had over their lifetime. What we just talked about in terms of brain development, what's maturing, the white matter tracts are maturing, any type of substance, any type of chemical, it can't be good, right? If you're using cannabis, if you're using alcohol, or even chemicals to alter moods and so forth, I know everyone is typically using those as a last result. All of these are going to have an impact in terms of brain development potentially. We don't know all of the effects, but the brain develops compensatory responses as it's developing around chemicals that are altering activation. In terms of positive effects, one more negative effect. One big negative effect. Okay, so I added this slide, so a lot of you, I don't think you have it in your, do you? You have it? Okay, I'm the one that doesn't. So the stress, I used to talk about it later in the talk. In any case, stress, chronic stress, is known to have an effect as well on brain development, in terms of negative brain development. It affects the regions responsible, or the regions mediating relational memory and stress regulation. So in particular, the hippocampal regions, and animal studies have also shown that in addition to a reduction in hippocampal volume, there's also an increase in amygdala volume, which is part of the lizard brain that's responsible for emotional reactivity. So it's sort of a vicious cycle, because as the chronic stress goes on, the individuals are less able to effectively dampen the stress. So this is another adverse, this is another negative effect on brain development. And as I'll leave that for later in the talk. So high levels of stress can also alter the brain in negative ways. We can also talk about positive effects on brain growth. The positive effects include aerobic fitness. So studies with 9 and 10-year-olds have shown that aerobic fitness affects areas of the brain that mediate attention and memory, so attention control and memory. And so in addition to having positive health effects, we can also think of aerobic fitness in terms of benefits for brain growth and attention, more focused attention. Other candidate activities for positive brain growth include organized music lessons and second language learning. And there's some research that's shown that these have positive effects in terms of growth in the brain. And the effects are definitely known to positively, these activities are known to positively affect cognition skills above and beyond the skills that are acquired. Okay, so far we've been talking about general trends. So we've talked about general maturational trends with respect to gray matter, with respect to white matter, with respect to connectivity between brain regions. All of these have been general trends. We haven't focused at all on individual differences. There are individual differences in these trends. There are differences in terms of the strengths of the connections for each person. So if we look at an age group, say of 14-year-olds or 16-year-olds, we look at 10 kids, we're going to note that they have different self-regulation capacities, right? And this may be largely dependent on the connections in these brain regions, their ability to exert top-down control over their lizard brain. So we know some kids are going to be more at risk for psychopathology, for stress, for dysregulation, for emotional dysregulation, and psychopathology. So it's important not to overgeneralize. We're looking at all the things that we're talking about today. It's important not to overgeneralize. Okay, so now we're going to start a different topic. We're going to turn our attention to maturational changes in social information processing networks. We are an extremely social species. We form relationships, we form families, we form societies, we form cultures. It's no surprise that our brain has developed specialized systems for social information processing. So we're going to talk very basically about 3 systems, a way to break it down simply so we can talk about it. So when we first walk into a room, the first thing that our social information processing system is doing is we're detecting any cues that might indicate social and emotional information. So we will be detecting facial expressions, we're detecting faces, recognizing faces. We're also detecting body movements and postures. We're also detecting vocal intonations in voices and so forth. One of the most well-investigated elements of this detection system are faces. And faces are processed, so when you bring anyone into the laboratory and show them faces on a computer screen and measure their brain activity, the part of the brain that lights up is right here, and it's called the fusiform face area. We know that this area is not fully mature until adulthood. So adolescents are not even fully mature in terms of their detection abilities for faces. The networks, the area, everything is still maturing well into young adulthood. aspect of social information processing is the ability to emotionally react to the information that you're detecting. So if you're detecting emotional information, typically we react to it in some emotional way that's appropriate. This type of reactivity is occurring in the areas that we call the limbic regions or the lizard brain. This is another area where a number of research studies have shown that there are very big differences in terms of the activity in these regions over the adolescent period compared to activity seen in children and adults. One particular part of this, or a noted finding that we've already alluded to earlier, was the increased sensitivity in the reward regions of the brain. So increased sensitivity to rewarding stimuli around the time of puberty. There's also some studies who note a decrease in terms of the reactivity to aversive stimuli, so a decreased sensitivity to punishment cues. So this is maturing actually around the time of puberty. It's an accelerated maturity in terms of the reward regions, which, as we'll see, hasn't caught up to the cognitive regulatory regions. So the cognitive regulatory system would be the system when you're engaged in social information processing that's regulating your affective reactivity in a particular situation. And we know from what we've already talked about that these regions are not fully mature during the adolescent period. So these are your prefrontal regions, your dorsolateral, prefrontal cortex, and so forth. This study is an interesting study. It brings everything together that we've just talked about in the previous slide. And it really illustrates nicely the variability in these measures. So in this study, we have children, from age 5 or so, all the way to adults in their 30s, measured, while their brains are measured, while they are viewing fearful faces and neutral faces. And we're looking at the difference in the MRI signal for the amygdala activity. And what we see is that what you can see quickly from the graph is that there's an overall mean difference in terms of that activity for the adolescent group. So from the ages between 12, or for the teenage years, it's hard to tell from this graph exactly. But we see this overall mean activity that's different, and it's enhanced for adolescents compared to adults and children. We also see that there's a lot of variability, right? There are some kids that are reacting the same way as children and adults, and some that are showing much higher activation. So one of the things that the researchers wanted to do with this study was, when they saw this variability, was to try to understand why this variability why we might see this variability. So they we typically look at the averages of each condition. So we'll look at the average of all fearful faces, the average of all neutral faces in our studies. They looked at consecutive presentations. They looked at activity for each presentation of a fearful face. And I want to bring in the notion of habituation here. All of a sudden, if we heard a sound in this room right now, a loud sound, we would all orient to that sound. We would all orient, and we determine whether there's something to be afraid of, there's something to be concerned with. If not, and the sound continued, we would all continue focusing on the presentation. You would habituate to that noise, and you would refocus your attention. Okay? That's the idea of habituation. In terms of habituation here, we're looking at amygdala activity and the habituation of amygdala activity to consecutive presentations of fearful faces. The first activation is going to be the strongest, or should be. If you effectively habituate, it's going to go down with consecutive presentations. What the researchers found was that the connectivity between the activity in the lizard brain and the frontal regions, the strength of that connection predicted habituation. So if they had stronger connections between the lizard brain and the lizard brain, then they could more effectively dampen the emotional reactivity that they were experiencing in response to fearful faces. They also measured trait anxiety. Trait anxiety, self-reports of anxiety. Self-reports of anxiety were also related to the habituation. If they reported higher trait anxiety, they were less effective in terms of habituation. Okay, so we see here a nice example of a study that's using the 3 components of the social information processing, and really a beautiful illustration of individual variability. Okay. So as I said, you can't overgeneralize. Definitely can't overgeneralize. What else is going on around the time of puberty? Around the time of puberty, we also see increased amounts of the stress hormone cortisol. So it's been measured across several studies that cortisol increases around the time of puberty. This study also illustrates that cortisone reactivity also increases. So this is a study in the left quadrant here of 89 children, ages 9, 11, 13, and 15, and baseline cortisol and cortisol reactivity was measured in response to a social stress task. What we see is that around the age of 13, the cortisol reactivity is going up, and this is particularly true for girls. There's a difference between girls and boys here. And this could potentially be related to, or in part responsible for, the differences that we see in depression, the onset of depression at this age, which is higher for girls than boys. We also see at age 15, there was not that sex difference, but it's still increasing in terms of cortisol reactivity across adolescence. So we know we have higher stress reactivity occurring around the time of puberty. We also know from other studies that there's higher emotionality, higher emotional reactivity as well. And we also know how important it is to reduce levels of stress, because stress can have adverse effects on brain growth. So puberty is a really vulnerable time for a number of factors influencing the brain growth in adverse ways. So if you are an adolescent, especially an adolescent girl around the time of 13, you're experiencing higher stress reactivity, you have higher stress in your environment, you're experiencing higher emotionality because your affective regions are maturing faster and they're reacting more. This is a cocktail for psychopathology, essentially. So it's no wonder that the lifetime risk for the emergence of psychopathology is around the age of 14. So we want to do what we can to reduce stress for our adolescents around this period. They're changing, they're reacting, their body's reacting differently in a number of ways. We're only touching on some of them, right? There's a number of, the hormones are fluctuating as well all over the place in terms of their sex hormones. So reducing stress, as we know, may be an effective way to help the system organize and allow them to be more effective self-regulators. It's easier said than done, obviously, right? But if we can teach adolescents stress reduction techniques around this time, and even before, to have them in place for when they are experiencing these higher levels of stress, we'd be doing them a great service, because their brain is still open to change. These self-regulation systems, these self-regulation networks are still developing. One of the important interventions that had received a lot of research in terms of brain changes is mindfulness training. Now, we just did an exercise in meditation, and mindfulness has been shown to help change the system. So even over an 8-week period of meditation, there have been increases in areas such as the hippocampus, increased volume in areas of the hippocampus region, as well as changes in what's called the temporoparietal junction, which is involved in mediating self-awareness. So there are regions of the brain that change simply from an 8-week training period in adults. A number of research studies have also shown that there are changes in the connectivity between frontal and limbic regions and frontal striatal regions. So these are networks involved in the regulation of emotion and attention. So it's been shown to be very effective in terms of increasing attention capacity. So we want to teach our youth as much as possible self-regulation strategies and stress reduction techniques. For a number of reasons. I mean, it increases self-monitoring of internal and external activities, but as well, we are also effectively changing their brain in positive ways. Another important function that I want to, or capacity that I want to touch on, because you know as well that it's not complete, it's not developed completely by the adolescent period, is empathy. We can break down empathy, and we can talk about it as involving three components. Detection, in order to empathize, you have to detect that somebody is feeling something. We can also talk about the emotional aspects of empathy. We are going to identify or feel what that person is feeling. And then we can also talk about the cognitive regulatory aspects of empathy. The ability to regulate what we're feeling with respect to another person's emotions. We know that some of these components are in place early on in childhood. So the affective part is well established in childhood, and we also know in adolescence it's definitely more emotional. Empathy is more emotional than cognitive. It's not until adulthood that we reach full maturation of our empathic processes. So we are using evaluative processes and cognitive regulation in empathy as well as emotional aspects. So all we have to do is look to an adolescent who is feeling a lot for a friend who is going through some problems, and we can see very clearly that the emotional part is going to overtake any cognitive control. So they may want to just ditch everything that they're doing in life to go be with that friend, because that is so important to them. It's so important to them in terms of what they're feeling for that other person, but they don't have the skills in place yet to evaluate how they should behave in that situation and what kind of limitations they should have with respect to empathy for their peer. From a brain perspective, we can see that the brain activity that's associated with empathy from adolescence to adulthood is changing from more medial orbital frontal activity to lateral orbital frontal activity. Medial orbital being more involved in the experience of emotion, and lateral more involved in the evaluation of that emotion. Okay, so we are seeing that with the brain research as well. So we know, all of us who have children and who don't, who work with children, that adolescence is also an important time for risk-taking and the emergence of risk-taking behavior. And one of the biggest changes that we see is an increase in risk-taking behavior right around the time of puberty. So we're going to talk about two models that complement each other with respect to risk-taking behavior and the emergence of risk-taking behavior over the adolescent period. The first model that we're going to talk about is from Monica Ernst down in NIH, and it's the triadic model of motivated behavior. It's very simple. It's saying that in adolescence, we have higher approach tendency, and that's mediated by the reward regions or the ventral striatum regions of the brain, and potentially reduced, some studies have shown reduced avoidance reactivity, so reduced reactivity to cues of punishment. We also know that the regulation, the cognitive regulatory mode, the cognitive regulatory areas of the brain are not fully mature. So this is much of what we talked about already, but just a nice illustration. Whereas adults, we're seeing a more balanced approach and avoidance in most adults, and regulation capacity. So what happens is this period of puberty, this time period, it leads to a very sensitive transition point where adolescents are having high reactivity in their reward regions, but they're not really able to control the feelings that they're having as effectively. So as Larry Steinberg down at Temple University in Philadelphia puts it, the engines are running at full throttle, but there is not yet a skilled driver behind the wheel. Now Steinberg and colleagues conducted a very large study looking at over 900 individuals between the age of, between the ages of 10 and 30 across 9 cities in the United States. And they broke down their assessments of sensation-seeking and impulsivity. So a lot of times when we take risk-taking measurements, we include sensation-seeking questions as well as impulsivity. We don't know, those two don't always go hand in hand though. If we are going, for example, you can break off a friendship impulsively, but you can also plan your sensation-seeking activity. You can go buy a ticket to the amusement park and plan to ride a roller coaster, for example. And according to the theory that we were just talking about the triadic motivated emotion theory, what we see is that these two are mediated by different brain regions. So sensation-seeking would be mediated by the reward regions of the brain, where impulsivity would be mediated by frontal regions, prefrontal regions, right? So this large study looked over time at, this cross-sectional study, looking over the various age groups at self-report measures of impulsivity and sensation-seeking, and they also took laboratory measures in these 9 cities as well, or a portion of the cities as well. And what they found was that from 10 to age 30, the impulsivity is on a decline. It's declining linearly. And that makes sense because the prefrontal areas are maturing. Our ability to control impulses are, as we saw from the white matter development, is occurring in somewhat of a linear fashion, right? And the prefrontal regions are the last to mature. So we see this increase in control, regulation. Self-reported sensation-seeking, however, is showing an inverted U. It peaks around the time of puberty and is still relatively high around mid-adolescence. So there's a very sensitive transition point here where your adolescents are experiencing this higher sensation-seeking and are still not fully able to control those feelings. Steinberg further says, as a result of his many experiments, that interventions capitalizing on adolescents' heightened propensity for reward-seeking behavior would work best in early adolescence. So, a quote by Steinberg says that interventions designed to capitalize on adolescents' heightened propensity for reward-seeking behavior, for example, emphasizing the rewarding aspects of positive alternatives to the behavior one wants to prevent, might especially be effective among younger adolescents. Give your children alternatives for this reward-seeking, safe alternatives in controlled settings for this reward-seeking behavior that they want to engage in, or a number of them want to engage in. Whereas those that are capitalizing on a growing capacity for self-regulation, for example, encouraging adolescents to pause and think before engaging in a risky behavior, might be more effective among older teenagers than younger ones. Okay, so we can be sure that what the outcome in terms of their risk-taking behavior will be heavily dependent on guidance and parental supervision. The next model that we're going to talk about complements this first one by bringing in peers. And we all know that peers influence. There's a peer influence in terms of risk-taking, right? We've seen it over and over again. I'm not telling you anything new with this, right? However, there have been a lot of experiments that are showing now that the brain reacts differently in the presence of peers. So we have a little bit more of an understanding as to why children are behaving the way they are in terms of peer influences. So this is Steinberg and colleagues again, and he has looked at risk-taking with a driving game. This is a computer game, and it's played from the driver's perspective, and there are 20 or so intersections. As a child is coming up to the intersection, there's a light that's changing from green to yellow to red, and they have to make a decision. Do they wait? If they wait, they will lose 3 seconds. If they go through and no crashes occur, then they have a 0-second delay. And if a crash occurs, they have a 6-second delay. And there's a monetary incentive to encourage risk-taking behavior to get through the course as quickly as possible. So risk-taking is measured by the amount of times they are going through these intersections. So what did they find? And I should mention that this was conducted earlier without peers' presence, but now we're going to be talking about the presence of peers, the condition, the social condition that includes the presence of peers. So the participants are asked to bring in 2 friends of the same sex to the laboratory. These 2 friends watch them play the game in one condition, and in another condition, they're not watching them play the game. Okay, and their behavior is assessed in both these conditions, with and without the presence of peers. And they've also brought this to the scanner. So they've looked at the brain activity while these children are engaging in this risk-taking behavior, both with peers, by themselves, alone, and with peers watching from a window. So what did we find? What did they find? Well, so the age groups, I just want to get the age groups right here. 14, so the adolescent group is 14 to 18. The young adults are 19 to 22, and the adults are 24 to 29. So what we can see is that in the alone condition, and we can think of this in terms of hot cognition, can't we? Because when the friends are around, it's more emotional. When they're in alone condition, they're making as many car crashes, and we can think of car crashes in terms of risk behavior as well. They've gone through those intersections. It's the same whether they're alone, they're very similar to children and adults when they're alone in terms of this behavior. As soon as they're with their friends, there's a jump. And this jump is very high for adolescents and not so much for young adults, but still higher than adults. So the importance of peers is borne out with these behavioral results for the adolescent period. This is replicated in the study that I'm showing you now. It's been replicated. And this is a study where the children were also their brain was being imaged at the same time. So the adolescent group in the alone and the peer condition is clearly, the adolescents are clearly making more riskier decisions. They're going through the stoplights more frequently when they're with peers than when they're alone. You don't see such huge, large differences for young adults and adults. And the number of car crashes, again, replicating the previous slide. So they're making riskier decisions when they're with peers. What's going on with their brain? Well, first of all, when they're going through the stoplight, this is not with respect to being with peers or not. This is collapsed across both conditions. When they're going through the stoplight, going through the traffic light, their reward regions of their brain show enhanced activity, okay? And this is shown only for adolescents, this difference. Be cautious, stop and go versus go through the traffic light. Very large difference during the adolescent period, right? In the activity of the ventral striatum region, of the reward regions of the brain. When we look at this in terms of being alone or being with peers during the task, we see that the ventral striatum region is lighting up or is much more active when they're with peers than when they're alone. And we don't see that same difference for the other 2 age groups. So see it collapsed across both conditions, but we can see here that this is more than likely primarily being pulled by the ventral striatum, the activity in the reward regions when they are with peers. We also see this similar heightened activity for this age group for the orbital frontal cortex, which is responsible for the experience of emotion, the conscious experience of emotion. So they have it coming from the subcortical regions, they have it coming from the lizard brain, this heightened experience of emotion, and they're also consciously experiencing it more than other age groups when they're with peers compared to when they're alone. Okay? So this is obviously, this increased activity is harder to control. It's going to be even harder to control when they're at maximum capacity in the prefrontal areas, right? So we know from the talk so far that the brain is more adaptable during adolescence, and it's more vulnerable during the younger years, especially around the time of puberty in comparison to adulthood. We also know that an adolescent learns better when responding to rewards. Other research shows very much that adolescents learn better when responding to rewards than avoiding behaviors because of punishments. We also know that stress is a major negative influence on brain growth, and that sustained high levels of stress are much more likely to worsen self-regulation than to improve self-regulation and to promote good behavior. So we really need to consider these factors. What we know from learning and brain-based paradigms, we need to consider the implications for rehabilitation, right? Okay. So in conclusion, I just want to say that adolescence is a time of forging new territory, forming new relations, learning new adult skills. The brain is adaptable in the service of learning adult skills and coming into adult roles. We see across mammals these changes occurring in the adolescent period. Across many mammals, studies of adolescence have shown this similar changes in terms of this increased appreciation or this increased sensitivity for novelty, and some animals fighting with their parents as well. So part of this is to promote the adolescent to leave the home and to go out and become an adult. So these are natural occurring activities, these are natural changes that are evolutionarily adaptive. So we have to look at these changes in a positive light, not a negative light. And we have to give our adolescents some alternatives when they want to engage when they're experiencing these natural brain changes. We have to give them some alternatives in terms of the activities, and we have to guide them, and we have to provide structured experiences. So there are negative experiences and positive experiences in terms of brain growth, and a better understanding of this will really help adolescents have a nicer time going through this tumultuous period. And given this vulnerability of the time, we can be sure that the outcomes will be dependent on the degree the parents and community are understanding of these changes and support the learning and self-regulation. Okay, so that concludes the talk, and then I'm open for questions. So, okay. Yep.
So I just wanted to confirm that kind of endpoint of adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
It's not 35, right? It's
No, 20. Well, the changes are occurring well into young adulthood. A lot of these group studies are looking at adolescence to about 18, okay. Young adults starting at 19, but the brain changes that I was discussing go right through young adulthood.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out when my son, who's turning 20, is going to not like risk-taking.
Just look at the insurance rates for cars, and then I'll give you some idea. Yep.
I'm just wondering what the implication is for our children, especially girls, entering puberty earlier.
Sorry?
Entering puberty earlier.
Yes, and yes, that's a very good point, because that's that's changing as the years go on. There's an earlier emergence of puberties for girls, right? So this would have implications for just where the transitional point is. It would be backed up, so there's even less cognitive development at that point. So it would be an earlier transitional point and a very dangerous one at that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my question follows on that. A lot of these studies use age and compare adolescence by age, and there's a huge variability, pubertally, developmentally. So I guess I'm wondering both in terms of how we take into consideration the effects of testosterone and estrogen on the brain, and whether any studies have actually looked at the pubertal stage as opposed to
Yes.
age.
Yes.
And they also do gender differences in these. I don't know whether these studies have been girls and boys together or whether they focus.
A lot, and as I mentioned, I showed you general trends, and so we're using sort of an average age for puberty onset for boys and girls. Girls are usually maturing their brain maturation. Some of what I've shown you is been shown to be gender specific, so girls are maturing a little bit earlier than boys with respect to all these maturational changes. There have been studies that are looking specifically at pubertal stage as opposed to age. So those are in line with these findings, right? Mm-hmm. Right. All of the studies that I presented today showed for males and females, and there were no differences reported in those studies for males and females. And some studies are looking, like the one in our lab with Segalowitz. I work with Sidney Segalowitz, and he's done studies just with males. We don't have to look too far to see that risk-taking is higher in males than females, right? I mean, you just look at who's typically in trouble for a conduct disorder, and there's a lot of sex differences with respect to risk-taking, so.
Specifically, was trying to get a better appreciation around the influence of peers.
No, those haven't been shown. The influence of peers was not gender-specific. So the same changes were shown with respect to females and males in those studies. Yep.
So clinically, for years, I've been noticing that there is a group of adolescents that do not engage in typical risk-taking behaviors. And often that's a flag for all kinds of other problems. So when they don't do the things that typically or normatively we expect them to do, they'll never color outside the lines. They don't engage in any normative risk-taking behavior. It could be a sign of anxiety problems or from a brain perspective, though, how do you interpret that?
They would be higher on the withdrawal related. So we've talked about general trends. We've talked about this activity in these regions, and I showed the variability in the reward region. There's also variability within the amygdala region and the response to reward. So these individuals would be higher on, higher in the fear system, higher activity in the fear system. So there's a lot of work that I've had the pleasure of doing as well with respect to shyness and internalizing behaviors and the fear system. So they have a heightened fear system being related to withdrawal-related personality styles and anxiety types of behaviors. So the heightened fear system and the automatic responses of the fear system in terms of conditioning to stimuli in the environment will create a situation where there's a lot of anxiety for social situations. So there's a lot of fear that's extended to a lot of stimuli that have been associated with various fearful situations. So they come into the world, a lot of internalizing kids and shy kids come into the world with a heightened fear system, we believe, with a heightened amygdala activities at baseline, just a set point that is higher than average. So they are learning, they are experiencing the world right from the get-go with a heightened sense of fear.
So not unlike what we see in terms of CBT and functional MRIs in terms of change in brain activity, if we're effectively treating those young people that have a higher fear kind of response and we're successful in treatment, have there been studies demonstrating change in brain function?
In terms of I haven't seen those types of studies. So looking at outcome in terms of whether or not their fear system has been dampened effectively, I haven't seen that. In some respects, we could look to see if their right frontal activity was shifted more to the left activity. We could look at amygdala activation over time. No, but I can check for you and see if there's anything.
Because unlike you, that don't want your 20-year-old engage in a risk-taking behavior, I've had parents that are thrilled when their 20-year-old starts to engage in some risk-taking behavior, and their marks go down a little bit, but not dramatically, and all of a sudden they have a fuller life. I'd be very curious to see if we'd be able to track the same kinds of brain functioning as we've had for other disorders, which are more externalizing in nature or...
They're somewhat under the radar, though, because they're not...
That's why this is a dissertation for your students.
Pardon? Yes. Yeah, that's exactly when I go to CBO, because they come under the radar. They're nice, they're well-behaved, they're, inhibited, so... Yep, in the back there, and then we'll go there.
When you were talking about the studies on alcoholism and the decreased weight and
Right.
plasticity of the brain, does that regenerate? Like, is that a bounce back if the alcohol decrease?
I haven't seen a study that's looked to see if this will recuperate, so I cannot say for sure that it will. From what we know about brain development, and it's open-ended at this point, I would like to believe that it's not a permanent damage that's occurring at that point. I believe one of our speakers this afternoon might be able to answer that question a lot better on the talk on substance abuse. So that might be a question that I believe, is she in the room? Or yes. Would you like to?
A whole lot actually, not necessarily. There have been some follow-up studies, but very few that have actually tracked longitudinally to look at sort of regeneration or the very hard studies to control. But I will speak to it a little bit, but there's not much to try there.
Okay, so there you have it from the expert in the area. No studies so far, but hopefully, if they stop drinking, they'll be able to. we need to show them the slide and say, hopefully.
I'll do it. Show the slide.
Yeah. Hopefully, this won't happen anymore if you just stop drinking. Okay, was there another question? Yep.
The effects of trauma and loss on brain development, does that show up later? Is it more or less?
So, yes. So trauma, early in life, the effects may not show up. Trauma early in life, the child might have appeared very resilient, and yet the effects show up around the times when puberty, when the brain is reorganizing and changing a lot of, I didn't talk about nicotine exposure, but nicotine exposure early on in pregnancy, a lot of the effects don't even show up till adolescence. So yes, trauma can definitely affect brain changes if it's happening early in life. It can affect brain changes later. And we also know that it does affect hippocampal regions. Those regions are regions of the brain that typically are able to rejuvenate. They are able to recuperate from damage. However, not with chronic stress, right? Because they're not going to have a chance to. I do have a slide. Are there any? I'm going to embark. If I have time, do I have time? Okay. I'm going to embark a little bit on a different topic. I find it very interesting, and it relates to trauma and things that people learn in those trauma situations. But before I get into that, are there any other questions? Because that topic might take us off course for a bit. Okay, so this slide, we'll get back a little bit to the inhibited behavior too. What we're seeing here are pathways to fear. We have Joseph Ledoux's work here. He's somebody who's investigated the fear system for decades, particularly with animal models. And he's established that with respect to the fear system, we have two pathways that are, for our purposes, that can be identified. One is called the low roads, one is called the high roads. One is taking information from our environment and through the thalamus, it's a region of the brain, sends it to the amygdala. The amygdala region is a region that will effectively arouse our system for fight or flight. Okay, it has connections with the HPA axis and the automatic nervous system, so it will elicit reactivity in our fight or flight system. The higher roads will sends the information that we're getting from the environment to the visual cortex, and then on up through the cortex for further processing, for more detailed processing and evaluation. So when we are walking, for example, we're hiking, we come upon a stick, or we come upon a big log, and behind that log we see something that looks like, it could potentially be a snake, but it's a stick, or we don't know yet. The first thing that happens is that your brain sends a rough template to the amygdala and says, prepare your body for action. We don't know what it is yet. We don't know if it's a snake or a stick. We just know that we better get ready. Okay, so it preps the body at an unconscious level. Very important here, unconscious and automatic. The slower roads evaluate the situation, examine the details, not that slow, we're talking about milliseconds, but still, definitely, one is entering at an automatic unconscious level, the other one becomes more conscious, we become consciously aware as to whether this is a snake or a stick. If it's a snake, the HPA axis continues to be excited and we get out. We have withdrawal-related behavior, we remove ourselves from that situation, or we fight, depending on what we choose to do. If we realize it's a stick, then our top-down regulation and control starts to dampen that. Okay. This model has been useful for helping us to understand PTSD. And so things that might occur as a result of disorders that will occur as a result of trauma. I'll give you another example of how this system might work and have carryover effects. The amygdala is responsible for, one of the important functions of the amygdala, is it responsible for coding information about the environment in terms of emotion. Is it something I should be scared of? Is it something I should be approaching? So it codes emotional information with the environmental stimulus that you've experienced. So what does that mean? We're in a restaurant, maybe in the States. I don't want to single out the States, but we're in a restaurant somewhere in the States, and I'm sitting at a table, and there's a red and white checkered tablecloth on the table, and a lot of other things in the room. All of a sudden, somebody comes in and starts shooting people. Okay? Very traumatic situation. I'm encoding, I don't realize it, but my amygdala is encoding information about that environment, because this is really important. Evolutionarily speaking, I've got to avoid that situation in the past, right? So I need to know about my environment. I need to understand the environmental cues. So this is being coded. About a year later, I'm walking down the street, and some man, a stranger, walks by me with very bad taste, and he's wearing a red and white checkered tie, okay? I don't like him. I don't know why. I have a gut feeling. I don't like this man. He gives me the creeps, right? I don't know why. My amygdala learned and coded that information. And now I'm getting an automatic response alerting me there might be something to be afraid of. What does that do? It starts my HPA reacting. Kids who have experienced a lot of trauma have a lot of sensitivity in the low roads. A lot of sensitivity. The strength, it's malleable. These pathways change. They strengthen or they weaken depending on the use. They have very strong low pathways if they've been traumatized. And they have a lot of signals, a lot of triggers that have been coded along with their experiences. When they go into a situation, a new situation, and you might teach them effective ways of self-control here or elsewhere. You're working with kids that have been in trauma, have been traumatized, and you're teaching them, you're desensitizing them in some way. You're helping them to effectively regulate their emotions. But they get into some kind of context, and they have triggers that are pushing these buttons. This is heightening their emotional reactivity. One of the ways that we might be able to help kids with respect to this is possibly through, I mean, I've been asked this question when I've given talks at other mental health agencies. Well, how can we change this? How can we undo these automatic responses? And we can discuss triggers, we can identify triggers. One of the things that we can potentially do is through mindfulness meditation, we can we can help them to be really more sensitive in terms of their self-monitoring and of their internal reactions and their external reactions to external changes as well. But by helping them feel those triggers, we might be able to undo some of that, and attentional control as well, so that they're more focused and aren't sent through this cascade of emotional feelings as a result of some of these triggers, right? So that is the only method that I know of to date, except for attentional training through computer tasks, which would take too much time and effort to personalize for each individual. The only technique that I know of to date would be mindfulness, and to help children to help individuals to reflect on that. Mm-hmm. 3 minutes. Okay, any other questions? Okay.
Remotely use of even mild in vivo exposure training for slowly pre-exposing to coded information
That's essentially desensitization techniques, and I haven't worked using those, and I would assume from all the learning paradigms that those can be very effective in teaching them self-regulation skills at that time, right?
I